Hi, welcome to Rev'd for Sunday, a lectionary podcast from the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm Justin Crisp.
I'm Peter Walsh.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
And today we're here for episode 58, the parable of the unjust steward, dishonest wealth, and so on. According to this parable, shrewdness is next to godliness. Let's take a look. Reading from the Gospel according to Luke, the 16th chapter. Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking my position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. Whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The Gospel of the Lord. What do you make of this?
So it is I'll start, but unless you want to start.
Go right ahead. Sure.
Just to say that if this is a parable, because it doesn't say it is a parable, there's 40 parables, about 40 working parables in the scriptures. They all begin with a parable. So is this a parable or is this a story? I just want to start there.
Interesting.
And say that we've just been through chapter 15. We've had lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. And our chapters of 15 and 16, the original scriptures, there was no chapters and no verses, right? So this could be considered all part of the same flow, but it does not start that this is a parable. So it starts with, maybe he told them this story. So I'll just start there. The second thing is, I'm reminded over and over, because I say the same thing over and over. So sorry if you've been on 58 of these things. I say the same thing over, that words matter, and I think we got the wrong words to even identify what the parable's about. The parable of the dishonest steward is really, you said it at the outset. I think it's the parable of the wise or shrewd steward, or it's the parable of the merciful master. And so I think that by what we call that gives us a way to frame how we interpret it. And that this is, the parable is ultimately about God, and it's ultimately about God as merciful, I think. So, I'm at 30,000 feet here. We're going to drill down and make, because this is super complicated stuff. And it's perhaps considered if it is a parable, the most complicated parable and the hardest one to preach on. And you're the preacher man, but you are super up to it. And we all look forward to hearing what you have to say. Yeah. So I'm just going to stop there so I don't hog the camera, but simply to say up here, still how we to begin to think about this thing. With these wisdom sayings chucked in at the end too. Right. Do they have anything to do with the parable or not?
Right.
Well, we're well into this travel narrative in Luke, and we remember episode I don't know, 41 or so, Jesus was setting his face toward Jerusalem. And, he's on a path there, unwavering. But all along with like a drumbeat, he's always teaching about wealth. We can't get around it. Chapter 11, he challenges the Pharisees to give their alms. Chapter 12, the rich fool forfeits his soul to build bigger barns, and a prudent steward is praised. In 12, there's this teaching about preparing for the final judgment and giving accounting for your things. And in 14, outcasts are called to the great banquet, the call of discipleship, and how costly that is, and how we're to give over all our possessions, and then in 15, which we skip over, or the rest of 15, we preached, or we heard about the lost coin and so on, but in the prodigal son story, we have this, the two sons and the father dispersing his wealth freely, generously, unanxiously, and these sons are like going at it, and here we come to this, two more teachings, this one, and then next week we'll hear another teaching or story or parable. But it's important to me, like, who Jesus is talking to. And I think in the first part of Luke 16, it says Jesus said to the disciples, he's teaching his followers about managing wealth, how to manage, not wealth even, but their stuff, and like managing the economy of their existence. And I think that in the next story, Jesus is talking to the parables, and it's more of a cautionary tale. Here, it's like, learn what you can from the ways of this world and be smart. You don't have to be, Jesus teaches everywhere, be childlike, and churches, in different parts of our history have thought that means naive and trusting and not thinking too much and overthinking. But, he teaches be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And, when you use the word shrewd, it's true. We don't want to think of a shrewd saint. It sounds like an oxymoron. But in fact, I think Jesus is much, much more nuanced than we like to be. And I think he's teaching about economy here much more. Speaking of 30,000 feet, I think Jesus is this could be some teaching about loyalties. This steward, it may be a thing about God, but if it's just the words on the page as a story, not about so much about God, but about us and about the world, I feel like this rich man could be just the way of the world, the economy. It's a grinding machine that, the collateral damage is a lot of lives, a lot of poverty, a lot of crushing weight. And Brian McLaren talks a lot about this, that this shrewd manager, he's switching his loyalties, from the needs of the very wealthy, serving the needs of the very wealthy, to serving the needs of the oppressed who are sort of crushed under the weight of this economic machinery. And now he's turning himself towards serving that side of things. And for, that's more of a liberation theology approach, I think, and in that framework, this story would slot right into that. That you can be shrewd by, you have this position to serve the poor in this way and kind of upend the system. And that would be, the reversal that Jesus is always sort of going at.
Interesting.
So I feel like that's, Brian McLaren's really onto something. It struck me as a very helpful interpretation, at least in that light, if we're going to get away from the literal idea of dishonest wealth, but maybe that's where you come in for some dishonest wealth wisdom. It's hard to get around that term.
Yeah, and you set them up with this
I'm
liberation.
not setting you up. Say what you want.
No.
But I that's where I was like, I could read this in a new way.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the puzzle of the story, whether it's a story or whether it's a parable, the puzzle here is that the money manager is unjust. So, and not just unjust in like canceling debts or anything like that. That's I mean, whatever. Unjust in the sense that he's doing things with his master's money, with his employer's money, which his employer wouldn't agree to, right? This stuff doesn't belong to him. And Jesus seems to be commending behavior which is immoral. That's the puzzle, I think. That's the shock value of the story. That's what sets up Jesus's move here. It's part of his pedagogy, right? We discussed last week that Jesus, when he's teaching, Jesus shocks people out of their preconceptions, and here is another preconception, right? We don't have a shepherd, who's an outsider to society, not somebody anybody would ever aspire to be when they grew up, a shepherd who is a hero, or a woman who's standing in for God in the parable of the lost coin, right? We have a money manager who does a pretty bad job, right? He squandered everything, and then he proceeds to misuse his employer's wealth behind his employer's back. This is not somebody who, you would want to manage your funds at Merrill Lynch or something like that. This guy deserves to be fired. And yet in the story, his employer commends him and then Jesus commends him. But the question is, what is Jesus commending? And Jesus commends shrewdness. That's what he commends. And so Luther, in a sermon that Luther gave on this text, Luther says that it's Jesus does this a lot, and actually we do too, right? We can't get too caught up in the oh my gosh, this guy's immoral, right? He deserves to be fired. If I did this, I would get fired. Blah blah blah. That's not Jesus' point. He commends the shrewdness, and Luther compares it to saying that. I'll just read you the excerpt here. Just as if I would incite anyone to watch, to pray, and to study, and might say, see, the robbers and murderers watch at night, that they might rob and steal. Therefore, should you not watch and pray and study, right? So you can refer to people who are really vigilant in doing evil, and commend their vigilance and use their vigilance as a really vivid, shocking, pedagogical tool to encourage people to be vigilant in good. And so he says that's kind of what's going on here. That leads me to my second question, which is, I think, the one on which this whole story or parable or whatever hinges, which is, what is the currency of the children of light? Money is the currency of the children of this age, right? That's the way that this story works. This guy, the child of this age, this money manager, uses money to win friends. Is this actually a story about money or not, right? You've given us a really incredible and powerful interpretation of this story as being about money, but I don't actually know if that's guaranteed. So to use Luther's example, robbers and murderers steal, right? To use Jesus' example, shrewd stewards cancel debts on behalf of their masters behind their masters' backs. What exactly are the children of light supposed to be doing? Is it the same stuff as those three examples, or are those three examples are they exemplary of an attitude which the children of light are supposed to bring to something else other than just money?
Wow, super interesting on that, and super interesting on your Brian McLaren liberation theology approach to this. I'll just say that I've never thought of either of these. I mean, when I heard you discussing Brian McLaren and the potential look at this through liberation theology, my reaction was, that is super interesting and it can't be true. Okay, that's eisegesis, not exegesis, that's laid on here because that can't be what Jesus was talking about. I'm talking about my reaction. I'm not saying I'm correct and right about anything. I'm really not. I'm just saying that was my initial reaction was, wow.
For all of you at home, you can feel the heat. It's getting hotter, okay?
So that's one. And then for you, that this is not about wealth. This is not about mammon. This is about a different currency. I'm like, oh. Well, okay, I got to think about that too. So you've each given me something to think about. And I guess I'm maybe somewhere right here. I'm between the two of you. So I think for me, the interesting word here is give me an accounting of your management. And so the accounting, that's an eschatological accounting of your management. This is about your end of your life, end of the world accounting of your life. And that's what this is about. This is about when when you have nothing, when all of the currency of this life comes to an end. I mean, you die. Let's say that you die, or the end of the world, depending on how you might want to think about this. I mean, the next week's is about the rich man and Lazarus, who are completely different, couldn't be contrasted more. And what do they have in common? They're both dead. What do we all have in common? We're all going to die. Right? And so this is really about that. This is really about what do you have to present for yourself when you die. And when you die, what do you have to present? Which is to lay yourself at the mercy of the master. Here we have a merciful master, and how we conceive of the master. Is it God? Is it Jesus? I mean, how do we present that? And how do we present ourselves? And I would say it is that we did the best we could with the stuff of our lives. And that stuff of our lives can mean anything. We live in a time where, for instance, we're all really clear of white privilege, right? So this was not a term, white privilege was not a term when I was in seminary. It didn't exist. And now we've all become aware of certain things. But even taking the whiteness out of it, let's just say, because these people in here are not white in the same way that we would think of white, for instance. And so let's just talk about privilege now. And the master, the steward himself, has the best job of all the servants. He's the chief servant of the servant class because he runs the household. He's the steward of the household. And so we get into this question about our lives. At the end, how'd we do? Did we do a godly thing? And what are we aware of but that clarity around things that it's all this or all that? It isn't. Everything is shades of ambiguity. I mean, that's what I was clear about when I turned 50, that everything was shades of ambiguity, shades of gray. And so this is a story in my book about the ambiguity of life, and that we do screw things up regularly, but in the end, what can we say is we did the best we could to figure it out so that when we met the Divine Master, we lay before the Divine Master's mercy and said, it wasn't perfect, but this is the best I got. That's what the story's about. That's what I think the story's about. And whether or not that's currency, whether or not it's mammon, that's the stuff all tagged on at the end. I think it's mammon plus. I don't think this is just about whether or not you tithe and give 10% of your money away. I think this is what you do with your heart. Jesus is always saying it's about the heart, right? It's about the heart. It's about the inner game. And with our inner game, did we do the best we could? With our inner game and our outer game, which could then lead to something like liberation theology. Should then, yes, right. Yeah. But that's kind of where I come from. And that's why when you launched into Brian McLaren and liberation theology, I was like, ka-choing, ooh.
I mean, I think these stories are always all the things. I mean, they're not any one thing. Particularly if it's a parable, it's meant to have many doorways in, and it speaks to many audiences. I mean, here Jesus is clearly speaking to the disciples, and he's teaching them something. And I don't know that it shouldn't be about wealth. I mean, they had to contend with wealth, and they mixed and mingled with all sorts of wealthy, poor. And Jesus teaches so much about anxiety over money. And that is not a rich disease. That's a poor and rich alike disease. Everyone's anxious about money.
Good call on your part. Yeah.
And and I think that, when you counsel couples for weddings and stuff, or you meet couples in distress, sex and money are their undoing always, intimacy and money, and maybe not in that order, I mean, I think money can always bring down a great household. And so I think it matters that it's about money. I think it really could very well be about money, but not money itself. It's as you say, it's about the management of money and who's serving. And Jesus is maybe teaching about whatever you have, big or little. If you're faithful in little, you are being faithful in much. I mean, most of us are just nickel and diming our way through life. We're not, we're not managing, we're not Queen Elizabeth and we're not Yvonne Chouinard, we don't have our $100 billion company to give away, which is so fantastic. I mean, that is shocking the world. that he gave Patagonia to his foundation to help enhance the environment. I mean, that's a radical move, and he had the power to do it. Most of us are not in that position, but we sure can appreciate the grand gesture. But most of us are like, are we honest with our paycheck? Or, do we spend wisely? Do we support the causes and the places that do good in the world? And, give to the poor when they ask and share our goods? Are we shrewd? I think that that's what Jesus is commending, is like, where always, where's your heart? I think it's important about money because, we can't serve God and wealth, and we spend a lot of our lives in anxiety around money. It's very preoccupying and stressful.
You're totally right about that. I mean, I used to read this parable. I'll just say I've always actually really loved this parable or story. I've got Father Peter in my head. I'm never going to be able to call this a parable without a disclaimer ever again. I've always actually really loved it. It's often been consoling to me.
This is consoling?
Yeah, it's often been consoling to me because I think I used to interpret this parable pretty straightforwardly along these lines, where I assumed it's about money management. I assumed it's about money. I read the whole thing through. You cannot serve God and wealth.
The last line.
And I thought that the point of it was that friendship is the shrewd steward's end, not money. And so that Jesus was basically saying, like, if your end is good, then your money management is good. If your end is money as such, right? If your only end is profit, if your only end is to make more, if your only end is just money, then your money management, there's something wrong with it, right? And so it's about money as an instrument rather than an end in itself. But I have to say, I'm kind of bored with that interpretation. I've thought it for so long, it's now dry as dust in my mouth, even while I'm saying it. I have to say, I am so tired of being told what to do. I'm so tired of getting advice. I'm so tired of people saying, do this, do that, believe this, believe that, don't do this, have this particular opinion, have that particular opinion, get rid of this, don't get rid of that. I'm exhausted because there's so many voices telling me to think and to do so many things that I just know I'm not going to be able to, I'm just not going to be perfect, right? I'm going to approach the throne of grace with boldness, the only person whose opinion actually counts, right? The God of the universe. And I'm going to put my accounting up there and I'm going to slide it across the table. And it's got to be like, did the best I could. And
Here it is, boss.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And I think, I just feel like I am just guaranteed, it's just guaranteed that this thing is not going to be good enough, because I feel like our culture, at least for me, I feel like our culture just filled with advice. Do one more thing, think one more thing, believe one more thing. And I have to say, I'm just totally, utterly exhausted. Now I read this parable. I actually do. I know I asked the question about whether or not these wisdom sayings are supposed to interpret the parable or not. I actually do think that they do, but I think that the key word here is serve and slave, rather than God and rather than wealth. So I used to read this through the word wealth. Now I read this through serve and slave. So slave nice. Here, the word slave could be translated servant, like a domestic servant. But serve is the Greek verb for enslavement. It's a form of the verb doulo. I'm really bad at pronouncing Greek. Doulo, which comes from the noun doulos. And doulos is the word for slave. Doulo is to be a slave, to serve, to be in bondage, right? And we are in bondage. If you can't serve God in wealth, well, it's actually not up to you. The slave doesn't get to choose who they're serving. That's the whole point of being a slave. They don't have any agency, right? They're serving this master. We are stuck. The children of this age, we're all the children of this age. We are stuck serving the gods of this age. We're enslaved to them. What we need is a liberator. What we need is Jesus Christ. What we need is somebody to set us free from whatever bad stuff, whatever false gods we are enslaved to, one of which I do believe is money, one of which I do believe is mammon for the sake of mammon. But the whole point of it is to set up God's liberation of us, God's setting us free from our enslavement to this stuff. It's not like I don't think the message is, hey, you're enslaved to this thing. Why don't you go be a better person? Why don't you go be a nicer person? I think it's, you're enslaved to this thing, and guess what? Jesus has come to set all the captives free, including you. And that's not about pushing your accounting across the eschatological judgment table, or about being told to do one more thing, give one more thing up, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's about receiving in thanksgiving the fact that in Jesus Christ, God has actually set us free. So I think this is a parable about grace, which means it can also be a parable about money, because grace is supposed to set us free from anxiety, free from the service of money, but free from the service of all of this stuff. Again, I think that the purpose of the parable is to just get us on Jesus' shoulders, like you were saying last week in the parable of the shepherd with the lost sheep.
Wow.
I love the pastoral word in what you're saying. I really love that, and it's very, nourishing as you're saying it. I have to put another word in, though, that I think it's really,
Yeah, you think we're supposed
important.
to do something.
I really
you do think we're supposed
money,
to do something.
Yeah, and Jesus cared about money. And
I
as
agree.
Peter, you famously say, money is energy. Money is not a bad thing, and it's not bad to have money. It's bad to hold it over others. It's bad to hoard it. It's bad to squander it. It's bad to, put it towards bad energy. And I think that Jesus, we wouldn't hear so much about it if he didn't care about it. And I don't think that all the stories about money are not actually about money. I think they are about money. And the way they're about money is that they're about the heart and about what we're in service of. Mm. The economy of God, the kingdom of God is its own economy. And there's no value placed on who has the most toys at the end. That's an absolute zero value. So, we're enslaved to the system of this world because we live in it, and we have to pay rent, we have to buy clothes, we have to feed ourselves. But there are ways to use this economy for the service of good and the common good, and to wit, the story about Patagonia in the New York Times, and Yvon Chouinard spent decades building this fantastic company, and he was never in it for the money. He was in it to make things he could climb mountains with, and he wanted good products, and then he slowly over time became more and more enlightened about the products, the supply chain and the labor and the sources and all that stuff, and he's built this huge multi-billion-dollar company that now he's given a way to completely ensure that it will always be in service of that purpose. Now for climate change, to stem climate change and bring back public lands and all that. So there's always a comment in the New York Times. I love to read the comments in the paper because they're so, on stories like this that have tremendous power, and there's always someone who's going to find a way to tear it down. And they can't, but they want to. They don't like it. We don't like it. Because I think that that's when we get monolithic about a story like this. We don't really want it. We want justice for this rich man more than we want these people to stop being taken advantage of by the rich man or overcharged, or, I don't know what's going on here. That is eisegesis. But I think that the manager, Jesus may be commending that this, where I am on board with Brian McLaren, is there's a way to, he has a position and some power to work for justice. So, in our imperfect place, we're all a mixed bag of honesty and dishonesty. Can we change our energy with money that we can't separate ourselves from towards a common good, or a better good at least,
Super interesting. Yeah, well done. And well done from you on the slave and the master, the serve and the slave comment here about that's what it's about. And then you're looking at this through the lens you've just articulated. I would say that one of the places we do need to be at some level is the scripture comments upon the scripture, right? And whether or not Jesus said this and then Luke attached this, it's still our scripture, right? And the attachment we take as the word, right? That this, and so the whole attachment about the two masters, and God and mammon, we have to contend with that. And I would say that this conversation can find itself rolling right on into the next conversation, which is next week. We've got the rich man and Lazarus, which is essentially this story just rolled right out. What are the consequences rolled right out as we talk about what's coming. So I say we wrap it up today and lean into next week, because what happens next week comments on this too.
That's exactly right. That's the trailer for next week's episode. I will see many of you on Sunday, regardless of where you are in the world. We wish you grace and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Please like, share, and subscribe. Help us to share this podcast and the good news of Jesus with the world in great need of it. God bless you. Bye-bye.